Hi, and welcome to Night Clerk Radio. This episode is Vaporwave and analog horror, Vaporwave and hauntology, Vaporwave and haunted memes. We're still working on it. This is episode 37. This is more of a topic episode. And of course, with me, as always, is my co-host, Burke. How are you doing?
I'm all right, Ross. How are you doing?
Since we've started Night Clerk Radio, I have been more aware of what Vaporwave is and what are the components of Vaporwave, what makes up Vaporwave, and what drives people to create Vaporwave. And I'm also a fan of horror, just horror stuff in general. It's neat. I like watching it, reading it, playing games, all that fun stuff to do with horror. And over the last couple of months, I've been sort of more and more acutely aware of this new sort of, I would call it a movement in horror. I don't think it's like a specific subgenre because there's sort of micro genres within this movement that I think are very driven by the same kind of impulses and cultural conditions, if you will, that led to Vaporwave. And there's multiple different components about it. So, you know, horror used to be synonymous with things like slasher films, you know, back in the 80s and 90s. And then, and like torture porn in the 2000s. And then earlier on, it's like Stephen King. And before that was Dracula. You know, Dracula, you have take things from folklore, make it into a novel or a movie, or metaphors for scientific progress gone awry. But this new type of horror is very popular on the internet, almost exclusively lives on the internet. And it's driven by largely anonymous crowds of fans and creators who use various social media sites and platforms to create new types of stories and forms for horror stories. And it's a lot of the same kind of things that led to Vaporwave. I think it's a new school, a new movement of horror, you know, haunted memes. I don't know, but it has a lot of different things in it. So are you as much of a horror fan as I am, Burke?
Probably not technically. I mean, I do like horror. It's one of my favorite genres. But I don't think I consume it nearly as much as you do. You seem to really enjoy just watching like random shit on Shudder.
I do.
I'm not opposed to. Obviously, like we could have Shudder parties if you wanted. But I do think you really dig down into the guts of some of this stuff. Like I am not into like creepypastas at all. Yeah. For example, which I know that has been like a thing you've really enjoyed and has made its way into games you've written or run. Or Role-Playing Public Radio, your other podcast. But no, I think horror is like sci-fi, where it's a genre I really like, but it has to be like done with purpose, I guess, for it to like really stick with me in the same way. So I don't know. Maybe by the end of this, you could convince me that I'm wrong on analog horror and that it has more going on thematically.
Right. Yeah, I guess we should start by defining what, because I'm talking about like there's different forms or different subgenres and that sort of make up this movement. So I guess we could start with me sort of listing all these subgenres, and the first of which is analog horror. So there's a very good explainer video that we'll link to. It was on Pat Chennington's channel, but it was done by a guest.
The Future Funk guy?
Yep. Aiden Chick. Yeah. Analog horror is about pre-digital technology as a visual symbol and style for horror. So it's very, very focused on 1970s to 1990s technology, VHS, but also broadcast television are sort of the primary symbols of this. And they do this in a very specialized, in a way that like mimics the sort of ephemeral and institutional kinds of videos produced in that era. So the biggest example is Local 58. Local 58 is a YouTube channel created by Chris Straub, who has done a bunch of comics. He's associated with the Penny Arcade people. He did like an emergency broadcast warning video about the moon. Don't look at the moon.
Oh, that's where that comes from. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
That was influential enough for a lot of other people to start making their own VHS tapes of like, here's something about the solar system. We're sending a space probe to explore the solar system. And then it finds, you know, an alien star or a planet or something from Gemini Home Entertainment. It's always done in an impersonal style. Like, it's, you know, just like, you are watching the end of day broadcast. Or so this is, again, very hauntological, you know, sort of like an alternate future or alternate present, alternate past. And again, the anachronistic media technology is to be more authentic and more emotional. In this case, it's more evoking fear because, you know, it's scary and weird and nostalgic for certain people, but there's a lot of people who never grew up with VHS technology at this point who are really into this stuff. And it's just something alien and weird from the recent past that they can still seek out. Like they can still find it in thrift stores and places like that, but it's, they have to go and seek it out. So that's one sort of subgenre within this broader category. The second one is, of course, I think most of us would be familiar with, which is SCP, Secure, Contain, Protect. It's a fan community. It's basically a brand without a corporation behind it. It's just this run by volunteers and fans, and there is sort of a licensing system, but anyone can make something SCP. And it's basically this incredibly powerful secretive organization that finds weird artifacts and creatures and contains them and protects them, both protects them from us and us from them. The main writing style in this is wiki entries on how to contain this object and what it can do and its history. And it's done in this kind of like, again, an impersonal sort of style. And it's also about like broken institutions, like governments and corporations are secretive and dysfunctional, but yet omniscient and well, not omniscient, but omnipresent, have total control and disregard for people's lives. So kind of like what Vaporwave is saying about corporations.
Yeah. And like, I never got real into SCP, but the writing style is often, whereas analog horror is, say, recreating news broadcasts or whatever, SCP is like recreating government documents. Basically, like everything is written in the style of incident reports, right? Yeah. Okay. I think another, just to, if people aren't into like niche internet horror, and I don't know how you found this podcast if you're not, I think, I don't know, I'm one of those people that says Control is kind of like SCP the game, because it is maybe not the main plot or whatever, but it does have lots of side elements of like, oh, here's like a weird haunted TV that if you blink while you're looking at it, you die, and like stuff like that.
And it's all controlled by the secretive government agency. And like there are documents you find in the game that mimic the style of SCP.
And also analog horror is in Control too, because it has all the VHS tapes. Like you find all the weird experiment recordings.
Control is a lot of like the distilling a lot of these things and making it into a AAA video game, but in a very cool way. I quite like the game. So within SCP, and I think a lot of these horror things that we talk about is the idea of hyperdigesis, which is something that's been around for years now, but like it was sort of coined, I think, in 2014. But I was only recently aware of it while researching this. And it's basically the iceberg. Like if you go on YouTube, there are all these iceberg theory videos about like whatever, and what I mean by iceberg is that you only see 10% on the surface, and that like 90% of the lore, the setting is actually hidden from us, the consumer of this media. And that's a major factor in a lot of these, is that there's all these implications and all these things hinted at, but you never see directly or find out. In SCP, for example, it's very common to have, it's pretty much mandatory to have redacted black bars in these documents to blank out names or certain elements of the story, so you never get the full story, which is of course what like actual declassified government documents have a lot of times, is black bars on names. So and we'll get more into the hyperdiegetic nature of media today, which is because it's very common and certainly has its own problems. But to list the other three things that I think are part of this, one would be creepypasta in general, because again, creepypasta is like for me, things like Godzilla NES, which is a creepypasta story about like a creepy Nintendo game that like is haunted and weird things happen. Also, it's that Godzilla angle for that, Japan obsession. Siren Head, which is an actual monster created by a specific artist, Trevor Henderson, but has become very popular, especially with a lot of like younger people. There's YouTube videos about Siren Head fighting Spider-Man and all this other stuff. Then there's like high class, like really well done things, which I'm really curious about, done by sort of an anonymous creators, or I'm not really aware of, like the Mystery Flesh Pit. Oh, yeah. Done through documents about this theme park, or this sort of like park, which is just this massive hole in the ground that is this colossal organism. Imagine a Sarlacc pit, but incredibly huge. It was turned into a theme park, but then something bad happened and lots of people died. So I consider that creepypasta because it's kind of done, you could just share one image of that and be like a brochure from the theme park. Visit the Mystery Flesh Pit. And be like, what?
Who wouldn't?
Yeah.
Also, one thing I'm surprised didn't make this creepypasta list was Candle Cove not creepypasta?
Oh, no, it was. I mean, there's so many things to list.
Sure. I know you love a Candle Cove.
I do love a Candle Cove. Interesting thing about creepypasta is that some of it is done by like known specific people, like Siren Head, Candle Cove. Actually, Slender Man, the original Photoshop is from like a specific person, and guess who owns that now? And you have to pay him if you want to make a Slender Man movie or TV show or whatever. But a lot of it is also anonymous by people who refuse to, like the Godzilla Nez thing. I don't remember, and there's a lot of them that are like clearly written by people who are not like professional writers, we'll say. Like,
yes.
And yet they're still popular. There is sort of a divide between anonymous creepypasta and like known artist creepypasta. So yeah, and some people might consider only anonymous creepypasta to be actual creepypasta. So then there's actually something we've talked about quite a bit, which is like the Caretaker and Dark Ambient, because the Caretaker became kind of a own meme because people are like, oh, this is the most terrifying album ever, which we've talked about in our review of the Caretaker. But also I think dark ambient type music is sort of an undercurrent, a lot of this, especially drone elements as sort of the soundtrack for a lot of these videos, the lo-fi scratchy nature of it, and plunderphonic samples of like old records or radio recordings. Again, the weird anachronistic technology.
Yeah, like signal wave type stuff, you know?
Yeah, broken transmissions. Yeah. For sure. And then the final thing would be, I think, one of the more minor ones, but I think is worth talking about, which are retro indie horror video games. There's a group on itch.io called DreadXP, which do the, horror game anthologies released through itch.io. And there are then, of course, slightly larger games like Dusk, which is very much inspired by Quake 1. And then, of course, there's demakes of games. So now it looks like a Nintendo or Super Nintendo game. And they're a lot like the Dread XP games are. Like, there's a lot of horror games now being made that are inspired by PlayStation 1 and 2 aesthetics. Like the clunky graphics, the sort of like blocky pixeled style, but still 3D, and the kind of game mechanics you would see in those games. And I played some of them, and they can be very, very, very creepy. Yeah, so those are kind of all the big things, the big sort of like part of this movement of horror. Yeah, and so they all have certain things in common. They evoke the past, especially the recent past, the 80s and 90s, analog media technology, and then a sense of alienation and depersonalization / dissonance, which again, where have we heard that before? Powerful institutions, malevolent yet dysfunctional, and driven by anonymous and indie creators and fans. And so those characteristics apply to Vaporwave to a T. And so the same things that happen to Vaporwave is now happening to horror.
Well, I guess we have to kick out Slender Man since it had a major Hollywood movie.
It's had more success in some ways in mainstream. And there have been shows, like there was a show on Sci-Fi Channel. One was based on Candle Cove.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There was a Candle Cove TV show. What was it? Channel Zero. The first season was Candle Cove, but then the second season was based on another creepypasta, The No End House. So now that I've kind of like laid out what my thesis is that this is a new school of horror, sort of all unified these things. Like, what do you think, Burke?
What do I think? I mean, I would definitely be interested in checking out some of it with you because I've never really watched like Local 58 or Gemini. One concern goes back to my first point, which is like things just creepy to be creepy is not always interesting to me. I like horror social commentary more, but that doesn't mean that like hanging out and watching something creepy with friends is enjoyable. So that's not like a knock against the genre. I never really got into SCP. I mean, I can tell you, I have my fuck Hyperdigesis.
Yeah, I do want to hear that.
I mean, it's not like that well thought out, but it's just like, this is exactly, it's one of those things that like, in theory, I love the idea of. But in practice, when handed to fandoms, ends up being a fucking nightmare, right? So I have a very strong bias against like prequels and remakes and stuff. Yeah. Like any prequel that's trying to explain some little thing, Star Wars probably being the most like famous example. Like I don't care about like how they got to Death Star plans. I'm sorry. Yeah. Like it's a one-off line that people worked hard to get it. And you go, oh, wow, I wonder what that was like. And you move on with your life. You don't make prequels. Or like, people get into these big, long arguments about, this is not analog horror, of course. Neither of these examples are, because I don't have good ones for that genre. But like Star Trek, because there's like a lot of stuff mentioned in Star Trek, like offhandedly, of like, oh, this is what's like on the Earth, and the Federation is fully luxury automated space communism, post-currency, post-scarcity, etc. And you just get all these like pointless arguments about like, what does that actually mean? What does that look like? That doesn't seem possible. And it's like, that's not the point, man. The point is that like they solved this week's problem by talking to each other instead of punching each other. It's one of those things where I really like, because I do like the implication of larger worlds. And I do find that stuff fascinating, but it also just, for me in practice, just produces some of the worst dialogue or discussion around media. That's all. It's not anything against the concept itself, but I think that's also only because when that stuff is like embedded in franchises and capital and stuff, that it then becomes a source of like, well, we know people like this, and there's this offhand mention to this, so why waste time thinking of new thing when I can just scratch a little bit down into that iceberg and get a whole movie out of it. I don't know.
Yeah, and you can see this, like there are creators who really understand this sort of type of horror and really play to it, and some would maybe even argue exploit it, especially the hyperdiegetic nature of it, because like the example I'm thinking of right now is Five Nights at Freddy's. I think that was very purposefully made to exploit fans wanting hyperdiegetic material to endlessly expound on and theorize on, and like it's engagement. If they're making conspiracy videos about like this little thing, and this game means that these people are actually ghosts murdered by this clown, and that changes everything. It spawns this whole sub-industry or like community of people endlessly. Like Five Nights at Freddy's was designed to be theorized about. Yeah. And so you can talk about 80s, 90s nostalgia, analog technology, like the hyperdigesis. So like it sort of fits this to a T, and like you can argue about whether this is just the artist's vision or like he was like, these fucking kids are going to eat this shit up, and I will just endlessly add weird little things and kind of wink and nod at them, but never acknowledge it or just kind of play them along. Because that's the thing about hyperdiegesis, if you exploit it too long, I think, is that there's no catharsis, there's no resolution, there's no finale, there's no like the end in a story. If you just keep adding more of the iceberg to the story setting, then like it just keeps going forever and never stops. I don't know. I think that's probably the biggest problem with it, is people will just keep making these things to exploit and never have like the end. It's done. This work is over. It is complete. And but on the other hand, you can't have a hyperdiegetic thing. It's like, yes, these things are unexplained and they will never be explained. So there's just going to be shadows. There's the place I have highlighted with my work, and then there are shadows, and that's it.
Yeah, it's a real precarious tool, right? Because like it's intrinsically interesting, but because it is, you're going to want to scratch that itch, and then you kind of ruin it. It's like a very unstable tool. Yeah. Which is hard.
The people who like this kind of horror, really do like theorizing and trying to derive meaning from, pattern and recognition, which, so maybe conspiracy thinking is sort of like an element of it, is kind of fictionalizing conspiracies and in some way making them more comforting, because at least this time it's clearly fictional, It's
clearly not real, but you still get to feel like you're indulging in secret information. Yeah, I can see that. But I think that's that type of stuff, and avoiding that type of stuff is why I think some of the music examples are probably the most powerful for me. So like of everything you listed, probably the thing I like the most is The Caretaker, because it's about something, and it has to be about something that's like unavoidable. It has to be like a loss of control is like a really important part of horror. So, The Caretaker is about dementia, right? And succumbing to it. That's like one of the most terrifying things in my like day-to-day life.
Oh, sure.
Is like the loss of cognitive faculty, because so much of like personality and everything can also be rolled into that. And it's like a real loss of self. And I think that album addresses that like in a really interesting way, but without being like, oh, what's, on disc 4, what's this recording? I need to find a story about this recording because I got to know whose voice that is. And it's just that self-containedness I really appreciate.
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess just trying to think of like a counterexample to hyperdiegesis stuff here. Yeah. And The Caretaker of the ones you listed really stands out to me.
Yeah. And I think there's like anything could be like fans can always add the iceberg on their own. It's like,
sure.
One other element, the commonality is actually sort of a de-emphasis on gore and direct violence. Like a lot of these stories, a lot of these things are, basically like even the SCP, people are murdered horribly by monsters, but it's always told in the clinical bureaucratic style that minimizes it. Oh, subject 5 was melted into nothingness by, SCP-6531 or whatever. And so I think a lot of this is also fans who want a type of horror that isn't just visceral gore that is so, because that became especially omnipresent in horror by the mid 2000s with torture porn, Hostel and Saw, and people really just assumed horror was men committing violence against women, and it was like, okay, maybe something that's a little different, but they still have the same elements of like body horror, and like dementia is a type of body horror because like,
100%.
So I think maybe it's also a reaction to other horror trends, like gore has gotten stale, like it's no longer scary and it's just kind of discomforting, just kind of like, ugh, it's cringe.
Just kind of pointless.
Yeah. Like gore is cringe.
Gore is cringe. So also to, I was going to say continue off that thought, but it's really not. That's a lie. to not be totally negative about this genre. I do really like a lot of the second person framing for a lot of this stuff. I do think that's like a really powerful technique because I do like stuff that deals with like alienation and loneliness and stuff, which I've talked about all the time.
Yep. Like it's common in a lot of music review, like
it's common in a lot of music review, but it's also common in a lot of media. But generally, I think the problem is like movies and stuff tend to provide some like resolution, right? So like whoever is alienated ends up ideally less so. Like, and I quote like happy ending, and this stuff doesn't really have that. It's kind of interesting. It's just you're sort of like exposed to it for a moment.
I mean, like it's about powerful bureaucracies controlling our lives, and it doesn't matter whether they're government or corporate. Like it's kind of in a lot of ways it doesn't matter, because either one can fuck you over and ruin your life.
Right.
But like, like think about like the MCU, Marvel, the one of the biggest media properties in the planet. They had a whole movie about an evil bureaucracy that was secretly fucking over everyone over, the Winter Soldier, because Hydra had infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. But at the end, it's like, well, we fixed it. It's fixed.
We got out the bad actors. We got out
all the bad actors, all the bad apples. They're all gone. And these works are like, no, it's impossible to reform the SCP. It's impossible. And they're distant yet omniscient, omnipotent. So there's nothing you do. And again, that's sort of the biggest difference between like corporate media that kind of goes after this versus these kind of themes and styles that are popular right now versus actually fan-driven stuff. Because the fan stuff is way more bleak. It's never going to have that. Like, as an example, I finished watching the new Netflix trilogy of horror movies, Fear Street. I came out this month. It was like one movie every week for 3 weeks. And it's about the same story. Each movie is very intricately linked to each other. And it was basically a structural problem. Like a town leader was really behind the thing that was causing all the bad shit. Spoilers for this movie series, by the way. In fact, it was the sheriff. The sheriff was actually a secret Satanist and his family had been Satanist the entire time and been like basically using the devil to possess someone in the bad side of town to murder people as a sacrifice to the devil so that the good side of town would have wealth and prosperity. And which is basically what I predicted within the first 30 minutes of the first movie. It's like, oh, okay. There's one good side of the town and there's one bad side of the town. Like clearly the good side of the town is using evil magic to like fuck over to, is a very basic kind of theory for it. But like at the end of the trilogy, the sheriff is dead and the curse is broken and everything's fine. It's been like a fan thing. Like, okay, well maybe the main characters got away, but like the bad things are still there and it's never going to change. So this is why I think this is driven by fans and corporations will obviously monetize it and grab onto it when they can, like Slender Man, but I don't think it will ever be truly adopted by corporate media because corporate media doesn't want to present like, powerful things are happening and there is no hope,
Yeah, the SCP movie, like The Rock would just punch the SCP.
Yeah, well, or there would be like there would be some kind of catharsis at the end where like the institution is reformed. We got out the bad guy, the one bad traitor of the SCP who is doing the bad things. We stopped him, and the rest of SCP is loyal and true, and everything's fine. But oh no, there's another threat coming. You have to stay and watch the sequel. whenever that comes out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think there's a lot of cool things going on in horror, but it's driven by people on the internet, and they're doing the most interesting stuff, even though they don't have the slick production budgets that Hollywood has or big game studios have. So I think these like smaller games and smaller stories, like there are fan SCP movies that are pretty well done, and I enjoy them. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to talk about it because it's the same thing that made Vaporwave is making now new types of horror.
No, I'm sold on all that. I'm with you on all that. So then I have, I guess, two questions to bring it back to music and our music podcast. So for these analog horror things, so let's not focus on the literal music examples we gave. Let's look at like Local 58 or whatever, somewhere in that. What is the music like for this stuff, if any? Does it have like drone, dark ambient? Is it, or does it really stick with the aesthetic and have like nothing?
Actually, there's a lot of corporate music is used. So like Gemini Home Entertainment will really use Vaporwave sounding music. You know, like what was the music that we reviewed?
The corporate wave episode we did.
So, because like a lot of it is to do this level of uncanny valley dissonance where it's like, here is an educational video about our space probe, and then like, and then
fire up the music core.
Exactly, the music core. And then gradually there is a shift from the happy music core to sort of like drone ambient, you know, as the implications are revealed and the truth is revealed. That is very common to have that.
I also imagine a lot of like drone and static.
Yeah, static.
Type
yeah,
stuff.
Radio static in particular. Silent Hill is a big influence, clearly, because, you know, you have that radio static indicating when the monsters are near. And that comes up a lot. So those are the two kinds of music that are really popular in there. Also, like, especially for like the Dread XP and retro video games, they will ape the style of those game soundtracks earlier. So again, kind of like Night of Terror, but, you know, done through a cheap MIDI synthesizer. Yeah, they definitely are aware. A lot of them use Vaporwave type music in their works.
And then my other question, kind of going the other way, is probably... The answer to this is probably yes, but we don't listen to enough to know. But has the switch flipped the other way where samples from this stuff starts to end up in Vaporwave?
That's a really good question. I
mean, you'd have to listen. There's so much stuff that's produced. Like, you can't say no for sure because you'd have to listen to literally everything that pops up on Bandcamp every day. But it would be really interesting if people were going real meta with it and doing like signal wave, broken transmission type stuff with. And if they're not, you could be the first, Ross. You could do...
Well, I'm sure some of those video games I talked about, I'm sure like the Dusk soundtrack is probably out there.
Yeah. I was really thinking of... I guess I'm really zeroed in on the analog horror specifically.
Yeah.
Subgenre. If people have like resampled that. Because SCP is text. Yeah. And unless you count like, you know, like you said, fan movies and stuff. But I was really wondering if somebody had taken a bunch of Local 58 stuff and like worked it into...
Yeah.
I don't know, in some plunderphonicsy way into the music.
Yeah, Local 58, I don't think so, because Local 58, he sources his music and stuff in particular. But I mean, there's like, if you watch that video from Aiden, there was sort of an like basically it was Local 58 for a few years, and then there's sort of an explosion, and now there's like 6 or 7 or probably more by now of these analog horror YouTube channels and creators. And I'm sure some of them have done music, the original music, not just, you know, sourced it from an existing place.
So I'm imagining comedy usages of like a sample of like Don't Look at the Moon and then David Bowie saying Just Dance and then it's like a dance banger.
Yeah, probably.
Do it. If you're out there and you want to do that, you have my permission to make that terrible song.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to bring this awareness to everybody, and just like, this is the same material conditions that led to Vaporwave are leading to new horror stories and new forms. And I think that's interesting and exciting. And if you haven't heard of these things or all of these things, I would recommend checking them out. There's a lot of cool stuff being made today. And I find it a lot, like I play more of these weird minor video games than like AAA titles these days, just because it's neat. And I don't care as much about graphics as I used to. So that about wraps it up for this discussion, unless you have anything else to add.
No, I'm just glad you got to talk about it. I'm definitely thinking about maybe after movies or something, checking something out one night, like a best of tour, a guided tour by Mr. Ross Bate. Yeah.
thanks for listening to this episode. I had a lot of fun doing it, and thank you, Burke, for indulging me to talk about horror.
Oh, you're welcome.
So our next episode, we're going to be diving back into the Vaporwave mines, revisiting hypnagogic Vaporwave in particular. People are still making that weird, dreamy, more ambient influenced Vaporwave, and we're here to tell you about it. So, of course, I am at Ross Payton on Twitter. Burke is at Burke McBurkinson on Twitter, and Night Clerk Radio is at Night Clerk Radio. Night Clerk Radio also has a Facebook page. So that's how you can reach us on the social medias. But if you really want to talk to us, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/nightclerkradio, where if you join, you get access to not only all of our bonus episodes, and we have released 4 or 5 at this point.
5, yep.
And we have a Discord, and you can talk to us anytime, and I post weird links when I find them, including the best, weirdest music I can find. And boy, I've raised some eyebrows in there, the stuff I have found. So please rate and review us on your podcasting app of choice, and tell your friends and family, maybe your enemies too. I don't know. Help spread the word about Night Clerk Radio. So thanks for listening, and stay safe in the haunted night of the internet or something.
Thank you.